The Millhaven Courier had been printing for 11 years before Clara Marsh walked through its door, and in all that time it had never once printed a story that made anyone uncomfortable enough to do something about it. She arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the cottonwood leaves had gone entirely yellow, and the wind off the flats was the kind that found the gaps in your coat. The stage had let her off at the far end of Millhaven's main street, which was long and straight and watched everything that happened on it the way a hallway watches. She had one trunk, a leather satchel worn at both handles, and a letter of introduction from the Territorial Press Association that she had written most of herself because the man who was supposed to write it had not, in the end, been the kind of man who followed through on things. She had known that about him for some time. She had married him. Anyway, which was the kind of decision that makes sense at 22 and instructs you thoroughly by 26. He had left Cheyenne with her savings, her printing contacts, and the small reputation she had built proofreading for the Cheyenne Standard, and he had left quietly, which was the only quiet thing he had ever done. She did not chase him. She packed what was hers, which was less than it had been, and she found the advertisement in the back pages of a trade circular. Millhaven, New Mexico Territory. Printer-editor sought. Honest wage, honest work. She had believed the advertisement, which was her second instructive decision in 4 years. The Millhaven Courier was owned by a man named Aldous Prentice, who was 63 and had a cough that had been called temporary for the last 2 years. He had placed the advertisement because he needed someone who could set type and manage the press and write a decent sentence, and he had expected a man. He looked at Clara Marsh standing in his doorway with her satchel and her letter and her composure, which was the composure of a woman who had decided in advance not to fall apart, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Can you set type?" "I can," she said. "I can run a Washington hand press. I can write copy. I can do the books. And I'm not afraid of ink or long hours." He looked at her a moment longer. "The pay is $14 a month and a room above the print shop." "That's acceptable," she said. "All right," he said, and went back to his desk. She set her satchel down on the compositor's table and looked at the press, which was a good one, better than she had expected, and she got to work. That was how it started. It would have stayed that small, stayed that ordinary, except that Millhaven was not an ordinary town, and the Courier was not, it turned out, an ordinary newspaper. It was a newspaper that had been made comfortable. That was the word for it. It had been made to fit inside the shape of what certain people in Millhaven wanted said. And what they wanted said was, in the main, not the truth. Clara did not know this yet. She was still learning the press, still learning the town, still carrying her satchel up the narrow stairs each evening to the room above the shop, which had a window that looked out over the street, and a small iron stove and a cot with a quilt on it that someone had left behind. She had hung nothing on the walls. She was not in the habit of hanging things on walls until she knew she was staying. The man who would change that calculus was not someone she was looking for, and he was not looking for her. He was simply there, the way certain things are simply there when you need them, not arranged by anyone, not signaling their importance. His name was Dade Sutherland. He ran the livery at the south end of the main street, the one with the wide double doors that stood open most of the day. He was tall and spare, with hands that had been broken and healed more than once, and a face that had been outside in all weather for 30-some years. He did not talk much. The town knew him as a man who kept his word about horses and did not keep much else, which was a reputation that had taken years to earn, and which he wore without any apparent awareness that he was wearing it. He had been at the far end of the street the morning the stage arrived. He had seen her get down with the trunk and the satchel. He had watched her walk the length of the street to the Courier's door with the wind pulling at her coat and her chin level, and he had gone back to work. He was not a man who went looking for things, but he noticed them. He always had. The trouble with the Courier began in the third week of November, when eldest Prentice's cough grew worse and he took to his bed for 4 days, and Clara, alone in the shop, received a visit from a man named Gerald Fitch. Fitch was not the mayor, though he behaved as though he were. He owned the largest general store in Millhaven, 2 rental properties on the east side of town, and a controlling interest in the water rights to the creek that fed the southern farms. He was a compact man with a soft voice and the manner of someone who has never needed to raise it, because the people around him have always understood, without being told, that there would be consequences for not listening. He came in on a Wednesday morning when the light was flat and gray, and he set a sheet of paper on the compositor's table where Clara was working, and he said, "Mr. Prentice runs a notice in the first column every week. This is next week's notice." Clara looked at the paper. It was a notice claiming that the water rates for the Southern Farming District were being reduced as a community service, courtesy of Fitch's Water Company. She had been in Millhaven long enough to know that the rates had in fact been raised 3 weeks prior, and that 2 families on the South Road had already lost their autumn planting contracts because of it. She set the paper back on the table. "I'll need to verify the figures before we print it," she said. Fitch looked at her the way a man looks at something that has behaved in a way he did not anticipate and has not yet decided how to categorize. "Mr. Prentice has always printed my notices without verification," he said. "Mr. Prentice is unwell," Clara said. "I'll have it verified by Thursday and we can discuss it then." He picked the paper back up. He did not raise his voice. He said, "I'd encourage you to think carefully about how you want to begin your time here, Miss Marsh." "Mrs.?" she said, "and I am thinking carefully." He left. She went back to setting type. She did not print the notice. She printed, instead, a short, factual piece in the second column about the water rate increase and its documented effect on the Southern Farming District, citing 3 sources by name, all of whom had agreed to be cited. She had spent 2 evenings getting those agreements, going out in the cold, to the South Road farms with her notebook and her plain manner, and the farmers had talked to her because she was not from Fitch's world, and did not seem to want anything from them except the truth, which was so unusual that it took them a little while to believe it. The Courier came out on Friday. By Friday afternoon, Fitch had read it. By Friday evening, word had moved through Millhaven, the way weather moves in a flat country, low and fast and ahead of itself. By Saturday morning, a woman named Dorothea Crane, who ran the millinery on the east side of the square, and who had a voice built for distance and opinions prepared well in advance, had taken up the matter as her own personal cause. Clara heard about it second-hand, the way you hear most things in a small town, which is to say imperfectly and from multiple directions. What she heard was that Dorothea Crane had said, in the millinery and at the dry goods counter and at the church steps after the Sunday service, that Clara Marsh was a troublemaker, and a woman with no roots and no standing in the community, and that the Courier would be ruined if someone did not put a stop to her before she put a stop to it herself. Clara heard this on Monday morning. She set it aside. She had work to do. Aldous Prentice came back to the shop on Tuesday, thinner than he had been, and he looked at the issue that was still stacked on the corner of the table, and he read the water rate piece twice. And then he looked at Clara for a long moment. "Fitch came to see me," he said. "I expected he would," she said. "He wants a printed apology in the next issue." Clara set down the composing stick she was holding. She said the piece was factually accurate. Every figure was verified. Every source agreed to be named. "I know," Prentice said. He was quiet for a moment. "He's threatening to pull his advertising." "He can pull it," she said. "The piece was true." Prentice looked at her with the expression of a man who has been tired for a long time and has just been offered something that might cost him more energy than he has left, and who is not sure yet whether it is worth it. He picked up the paper again. He read the piece a third time. "All right," he said. And he went and sat down at his desk. That was the second week. The third week, Fitch pulled his advertising. The fourth week, he visited 2 of the other regular advertisers, and they pulled theirs as well. The paper grew thin. Prentice did not complain, but Clara could see the ledger on his desk, and she could see what thin meant. She began going out in the evenings with her notebook, not to the South Road this time, but to the town itself, to the smaller merchants, the bootmaker, the saddle shop, the woman who ran the boarding house on the north end, the barber, the man who repaired clocks and watches in a small room above the hardware store. She asked them about their businesses. She wrote about them plainly and specifically, the kind of writing that names the thing you do and makes it real to people who have walked past your door for years without knowing what was inside. 3 of them bought advertising space. 2 more came in on their own the following week, having read what she had written about their neighbors. The paper did not grow fat, but it did not fold. Dade Sutherland read the Courier the way he had always read it, which was to say he read it on Friday evenings at the table in the back of the livery where he kept his accounts. And he set it down when he was done. He had read Prentice's Courier for years, and had thought of it the way you think of something that is there and functioning, but not doing anything in particular. He read Clara Marsh's Courier differently. He was not sure at first what the difference was. Then he was sure. The difference was that it was true. He did not go to the paper to say so. He was not a man who went places to say things. But on a Thursday morning in late November, when Clara was coming back from the post office with the week's mail and the wind was doing its worst off the flats, she dropped her satchel on the icy boardwalk in front of the livery, and everything in it slid out into the cold and across the planks. Dade was in the doorway. He came out without a word and collected the papers and the notebook and the 2 wrapped packages and the leather strap that had finally given way, and he handed them back to her. She said, "Thank you." He looked at the broken strap. He said, "Leave the satchel." She looked at him. He had already gone back inside. She set the satchel on the livery step and went on to the print shop. The satchel was on the step the next morning, repaired. The strap was not just mended but reinforced, doubled with a second piece of leather stitched over the break point. She picked it up and examined it. The stitching was even and close. It would not break again. She carried it up the stairs to her room and set it on the chair. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back down and started the press. She said nothing about the strap. She did not know then that this was the beginning of something. She thought it was a kindness from a neighbor, which it was. She did not yet know that it was also the first sentence of a longer thing. December came in hard. The flats went white, and the wind did not relent, and Millhaven pulled itself in close the way small towns do in cold weather, drawing the curtains and gathering at the stove and talking. What it talked about, in part, was Clara Marsh and the Courier, and the water rate story, which had not gone away because the water rates had not gone away. 2 of the South Road farmers had organized a petition. Clara had covered it. The petition had 43 signatures. She had printed all 43 names. Fitch had not come back to the shop. He worked, instead, through Dorothea Crane, which was the method of a man who understood that certain kinds of pressure are more effective when they appear to come from the community rather than from a single interested party. Dorothea Crane told anyone who would listen that Clara Marsh was destroying the cooperative spirit of Millhaven, that she had an agenda, that she was a woman with no community ties and no investment in the town's well-being, that she had come from somewhere else under circumstances that were, Dorothea implied without specifying, worth looking into. What Dorothea Crane was implying, without ever saying it plainly, was the failed marriage, which she had obtained from the stage driver, who had obtained it from someone in the next town, who had assembled it from pieces that were partly true and partly not. The version Dorothea told was worse than the truth, which is how these things usually go. Clara heard the version that was circulating. She heard it the way she heard everything in Millhaven. through the small merchants who had become, without formal arrangement, something like allies. The bootmaker told her. He told her plainly and without embellishment, and he added that he thought it was a damn shame, and Clara thanked him and went back to the shop. Prentice was there. He had heard it too. He looked at her over his spectacles and said, "You could print a correction." "There's nothing to correct," she said. "She hasn't printed anything. She's just talking. You could address it anyway." "No," Clara said. "I'm not going to use the paper to defend myself. The paper is for the town's business, not mine." Prentice was quiet. Then he said, "That's a harder line to hold than it sounds." "I know," she said. And she went back to the type cases. It was during this time, the cold middle of December, that the small accumulations began. She noticed them the way you notice things that are not announced, which is slowly and with a slight sense of not trusting your own perception. A cord of wood appeared beside the back door of the print shop one morning, stacked neatly and covered with canvas against the snow. She asked Prentice. He shook his head. She thought of the livery at the end of the street and said nothing. On a Friday evening, when she was working late on the next issue, she heard the door at the bottom of the stairs open and close. And in the morning there was a paper bag on the step with 2 biscuits in it, and a small twist of paper that held salt and dried meat. She stood there with the bag in her hands in the cold morning light, and she thought about going to the livery to say something, and she thought about what she would say. And she went back inside and made coffee and ate the biscuits at the compositor's table. She did not say anything. Neither did he. The narrator notes that neither of them said anything, and that this was not an accident. The following week, Dade Sutherland came into the print shop on a Wednesday afternoon. He stood at the counter and he looked at the press and then at Clara, who was setting type and did not stop. He said, "The step at the bottom of your outside stair is loose. I'll fix it Saturday if that's all right." She looked up. She said, "That's all right." He nodded and left. He fixed the step on Saturday. She heard him working while she was inside setting the week's type, the sound of the hammer measured and unhurried in the cold morning. When she came down at noon, he was gone. The step was solid. She tested it twice, pressing down with her full weight. It did not move. She said nothing about the step. He said nothing about it either. But that afternoon, when he came past the shop on his way back from the feed merchant, she had left a mug of coffee on the outside sill with a cloth over it, to hold the warmth. He stopped. He looked at the mug. He looked at the window. He picked up the mug and drank it standing there in the cold, and then he set it back on the sill and walked on. Prentice watched this from the window. He said nothing. The issue of the week after Christmas was the one that changed things. Clara had been working on a piece for 3 weeks, gathering it quietly, going back to the South Road Farms and to the county records office and to 2 men in the next town who had dealt with Fitch's water company before Millhaven had. What she had found was not complicated. It was simply documented. Fitch's water company had been incorporated under a territorial charter that contained a rate cap provision, a provision that his current rates were in violation of by a significant margin. The charter was public record. She had a copy. She had the rate schedules. She had the cap provision. She had a statement from a territorial land attorney obtained by post that confirmed the violation in plain language. She showed it to Prentice before she said it. He read it twice. He said, "He'll come for the paper." "He'll try," she said. "Clara." He took his spectacles off and set them on the desk. "He has friends on the territorial court. He has money. He has time. We have $14 a month and a press." "We have the charter," she said, "and we have the names." He put his spectacles back on. He looked at the piece again. He said, "Set it." She said it. It ran in the first column of the first page of the first issue of the new year, and it was the plainest piece she had ever written, which made it the most devastating. It named the charter provision. It named the current rates. It named the cap. It named the overage. It named Fitch. It named the 2 South Road families who had lost their contracts. It named the territorial land attorney and quoted him directly. It was 460 words, and it contained no opinion and no rhetoric and nothing that was not documented. And it was the truest thing the Millhaven Courier had ever printed. By Friday afternoon, Fitch had read it. By Friday evening, he had been to see the sheriff, who was a man named Beaumont, an old and careful man who listened to Fitch and then said he would look into it, and then did not, because there was nothing to look into that the piece had not already laid out. By Saturday morning, Fitch had been to see 2 members of the town council. By Saturday afternoon, he had come to the print shop. He did not come alone. He brought Dorothea Crane, which was a mistake, though he did not know it yet, and he brought a man named Pollard, who served as the council's informal secretary and who was carrying a piece of paper. They came in, and Fitch put both hands on the counter and said, in his soft voice, "Mrs. Marsh, you have printed a defamatory piece about my company and my business practices, and I am giving you the opportunity to print a retraction and an apology in next week's issue, or to face the consequences of your decision not to." Clara was at the compositor's table. She set down the composing stick. She said, "Everything in that piece is documented. I have the documents here. I have copies at the post office, and with 2 people in this town and 1 outside it. If you'd like to review them, I'll show them to you." Fitch's voice stayed soft. "Print the apology, or I will have this paper shut down, and I will see to it that you do not work in this territory again." Dorothea Crane said, from behind him, "And the town would be better for it. I think most people would agree." Clara looked at her. Then she looked at Fitch. She said, "I will not print a retraction of a true story. If you believe the piece is inaccurate, you are welcome to submit a letter to the editor with your corrections, and I will print it in full, unedited." Fitch straightened. He said, "Then we're done here." He turned and left. Dorothea Crane gave Clara one long look and followed him. Pollard set the piece of paper on the counter, which was a letter from the council requesting the Courier's immediate cooperation in the matter, and then he left too. The door closed. The shop was quiet. Prentice was at his desk in the back, and he had not moved during the entire exchange. Now he said, without looking up, "Well?" "Well," Clara said, and she went back to the typecases. What happened next happened in public, which was where it needed to happen. The following Tuesday morning, Fitch convened an informal meeting at the town hall, which was a large room above the hardware store that served as the civic center of Millhaven. He had sent word to the council members, and to the major merchants and to the heads of the prominent families. He had not sent word to Clara, but word found her anyway, through the bootmaker, who came to the print shop at 7 in the morning and said she ought to know. She knew. She went. She arrived at the town hall to find it already full. Fitch was at the front of the room with Pollard beside him, and a stack of papers on the table. Dorothea Crane was in the second row with 3 women, Clara recognized from the church steps. The bootmaker was in the back. The saddle-maker was beside him. Several of the South Road farmers were standing along the wall, which was unusual, because they did not typically come into town on a Tuesday. Clara took a place near the back, beside the window. Fitch began. He spoke for some time about community standards and the responsibilities of the press and the harm that irresponsible reporting could do to the business climate of a town. He spoke about the Courier's history of responsible journalism and the unfortunate change in direction that had occurred since a certain person had taken over its day-to-day operations. He spoke about his water company's contributions to the development of the Southern District. He did not once address the charter provision, or the rate cap, or the documented overage. When he finished, he looked around the room and said, "I think most of you would agree that the community's interests are best served by a press that works with its neighbors rather than against them." There was a silence. Then Dade Sutherland, who was standing near the door, said, I read the piece. Fitch looked at him. Dade. I read the piece, Dade said again. And I read the charter provision she cited. I went to the records office Thursday morning. She had it right. He was not a man who made speeches. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and without ornamentation, and then he stopped. There was another silence, longer this time. One of the South Road farmers said, "She had it right." Then the second one said it. Then a third. The bootmaker said from the back, "I've advertised with the Courier for 6 weeks. I've had more customers come in and say they read about my shop than in the previous 2 years combined. I don't have a complaint." Dorothea Crane said sharply, "This isn't about advertising." "No," said the woman who ran the boarding house, who was seated near the front and had not spoken until now. "It's about whether the water rates are legal. And apparently they're not." The room shifted. It did not shift loudly. It shifted the way a river shifts when the grade changes, quietly and completely. And afterward the water is going a different direction, and there is no particular moment you can point to when it changed. Fitch looked around the room. His voice, when he spoke again, was still soft, but something had gone out of it. He said, "I intend to pursue this matter through the appropriate channels." "That's your right," said old Sheriff Beaumont from his chair by the wall, mildly. "Appropriate channels are what they're there for." Fitch picked up his papers. He said nothing else. He left, and Pollard followed him, and Dorothea Crane stood for a moment, looking at the room with the expression of a woman who has prepared extensively for a different outcome. And then she left too. Clara stood by the window and watched the room settle. The South Road farmers were talking to the bootmaker. The boarding house woman was talking to the saddle maker. The sheriff was putting on his hat. Dade Sutherland was still by the door. He looked at her once, briefly, and then he went out. She walked back to the print shop in the cold morning air, and she sat down at the compositor's table, and she did not move for a little while. Not because she was undone, because something had shifted in her too, and she was taking stock of what it was. Prentice came in at 10. He had heard. He sat down at his desk and looked at her and said, "The Territorial Land Office sent a letter this morning. They're opening an inquiry into the water company's rate schedule." Clara said, "Good. Fitch will contest it." "He can," she said. "The charter provision isn't going anywhere." Prentice nodded. He looked at his desk for a moment. Then he said, "You're a better editor than I was." She looked at him. He was looking at his desk. She said, "You built something worth being better at." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went back to his papers. January settled into the steady cold of a high country winter, and Millhaven settled into a new kind of quiet. Fitch's inquiry into the Courier did not proceed. The Territorial Land Office's inquiry into the water company did. 3 of the advertisers who had left came back. 2 new ones came in. The South Road farmers organized a formal rate dispute through the county clerk's office, using the charter provision as their basis, and Clara covered every stage of it, plainly and factually, and the coverage was read. Dorothea Crane did not come to the print shop. She did not, in the weeks that followed, stop talking entirely, but what she said became quieter and less specific, and eventually it became the kind of talk that is more habit than conviction, and then it became very nearly nothing. This was as close to an apology as Dorothea Crane was ever going to offer, and Clara did not require anything more. Fitch's name appeared in the paper 3 more times that winter, each time in connection with the rate inquiry, each time accurately. He did not come back to the shop. His silence on the matter was the only concession he made, and it was, in its way, sufficient. The small accumulations continued. A jar of preserved peaches appeared on the print shop step one morning in mid-January with no note. Clara ate them over the course of a week, at the compositor's table, in the evenings. She thought about the livery. She thought about the repaired satchel and the cord of wood, and the biscuits, and the coffee mug on the sill. She thought about a man who showed his thinking through his hands and his actions, and not through his words. And she thought about what that meant, and she thought about it carefully, because she had not always thought carefully about such things, and she intended to do better. She had not hung anything on the walls of the room above the shop. She was still not certain she was staying. On a Thursday evening in the late January, she was locking the front door of the shop when Dade Sutherland came down the boardwalk from the direction of the livery. He stopped. She stopped. The street was empty in the blue cold of early evening, and the light was going fast off the flats, pulling the color out of the storefronts before you were ready for it to leave. He said, "I heard the land office set a hearing date." "February 14th, she said. He nodded. He looked at the street and then back at her. He said, "You did a good thing." She said, "I did my job." "Yes," he said. "That's what I meant." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then he said, "There's a supper at the Hendersons Saturday. The South Road families. They asked me to ask if you'd come." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance in the way of a man delivering a message and not adding anything to it. She said, "I'll come." He nodded and went on. She stood there for a moment in the cold, and then she went upstairs. She did not examine the feeling that was sitting quietly in her chest. She was not ready to examine it. She went to the window and looked out at the street, which was empty and cold and familiar in the way that a place becomes familiar when you have walked it in all weathers for 3 months, and she thought that it looked like a place a person could stay. She did not hang anything on the walls that night, but she thought about it. The supper at the Hendersons was a large, warm, loud thing, a long table in a low-ceilinged room with 4 families around it and children underfoot, and 2 kinds of pie and a fire going hard in the corner. Clara sat between the bootmaker's wife, who had come along, and a woman named Ruth Henderson, who ran the South Road's largest farm with her husband, and who had a manner of direct, unadorned friendliness that Clara found immediately restful. Dade sat across the table, 3 seats down. He talked to the men around him in the sparse, unhurried way he talked to everyone. He did not look at Clara more than he looked at anyone else. She did not look at him more than she looked at anyone else. But at some point during the second course, one of the Henderson children, a girl of about 4 who had been watching Clara from the end of the table with the focused attention of a small person conducting a thorough evaluation, climbed down from her chair and came around the table and put her hand on Clara's arm. Clara looked down at her. The girl said, "You're the newspaper lady." "I am," Clara said. The girl considered this. She said, "My papa reads it out loud." "Does he?" Clara said. "Every Friday," the girl said, with the gravity of someone reporting a sacred observance. Then she climbed back into her chair. Ruth Henderson caught Clara's eye and smiled. Clara looked down at her plate. Something had moved through her that she did not have a name for yet. Something warm and unguarded, and she let it be there for a moment before she set it aside. She looked up and found Dade looking at her from 3 seats down. He looked away. The corner of his mouth had moved once and returned to where it had been. She went back to her supper. February came in with a thaw, and then a hard freeze, and then another thaw, the way February does in high country, unable to commit. The territorial hearing was set for the 14th, and Clara was preparing the coverage, which would be the most significant thing the Courier had printed. She was working long days and some evenings, and on one of those evenings, a Wednesday, she fell asleep at the compositor's table with her head on her arms and a half-set tray of type in front of her. She woke to the sound of the stove being fed. She lifted her head. The shop was warm, and the lamp on the table had been trimmed, and the door to the outside was just closing. She sat up and looked at the stove, which was burning steadily, and at the lamp and at the door. She sat there for a moment in the warm, quiet shop, and she thought about a man who had come in out of the cold to feed her stove and trim her lamp, and then gone back out without waking her. and she thought that she had been wrong earlier. When she had thought she was not ready to examine the feeling, she was ready. She had been ready for some time. She had simply been careful, which was not the same thing as not being ready, and which had been the right approach, and which was now, she thought, complete. She went upstairs. She took the small frame photograph from her satchel, the one of her mother and father taken before the hard years, and she hung it on the wall, above the cot. Then she stood back and looked at it. She was staying. The hearing on February 14th went as the documentation said it would. The territorial land officer reviewed the charter provision, and the rate schedules, and the overage calculations, and the attorney's statement, all of which Clara had provided in advance. And he found in favor of the South Road farmers on every substantive point. Fitch's rates were ordered reduced to the charter cap, retroactive to the date of the first violation. The overage charges were to be credited against future bills. Fitch was present. He said nothing during the hearing that changed anything. He left without speaking to anyone. Clara covered the hearing in full. The piece ran on the front page of the February 17th issue, and it was the longest piece the Courier had ever printed, and it was read by everyone in Millhaven and, eventually, by several people in the next 3 towns, because copies traveled. Prentice read it at his desk on Friday morning, and then he looked up and said, "I think we need to talk about the paper." She looked at him. He said, "I'm not well, Clara. I've known it for a while. The cough isn't temporary." He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing he has been carrying long enough that the weight of it has become ordinary. "I want to sign the paper over to you. The press, the building, the subscription list, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Aldous, it's what I want," he said. "You've already made it what it should have been. I'd like to know it stays that way." She looked at the press. She looked at the type cases and the stacked paper and the ledger on the desk, and the window that looked out over the main street of Millhaven, which she had walked in all weathers for 4 months, and which she knew, now the way you know a place you have decided to be in. She said, "All right." "All right," he said, and he went back to his papers. It was a Saturday in early March, the kind of day that arrives in a high country like a promise the land is making to itself, the light clean and cold, and the air carrying something that was not quite warmth but was the direction of warmth. When Dade Sutherland came to the print shop and knocked on the open door, Clara looked up from the compositor's table. He came in and he stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, which was not a thing she had seen him do before, and she set down the composing stick and waited. He said, "I've been thinking about something for a while." She said, "All right." He said, "I'm not good at saying things. I'm better at doing them. But I think this one needs saying." She waited. He said, "I've watched you come into this town with nothing but a satchel and a letter, and do the thing that needed doing, and do it without complaint and without asking anyone's permission. And I've watched the town come around to what it should have been from the start, and I think—" He stopped. He started again. "I think you're the steadiest person I've met in a long time, and I'd like to know you better. I'm asking you to consider staying, not just for the paper. I'm asking if you'd consider staying as my wife, if that's something you could want. I'm not asking you to decide now. I'm not asking you to decide fast. I'm asking you to think about it and tell me when you know." He stopped. He looked at her steadily and without performance. A man who had said the thing, and meant it, and was now waiting, prepared to wait as long as it took. She looked at him. She thought about the satchel on the step, and the cord of wood and the biscuits, and the stove fed in the dark, and the step repaired without comment, and the coffee on the sill, and the supper across the table, and the corner of his mouth that moved once and returned. And she thought about the photograph on the wall above the cot and what it meant that she had hung it there. She said, I don't need to think about it." He looked at her. She said, "Yes, that's what I want." Something moved across his face that was not quite what she had expected, which was relief, but was larger than relief and quieter. He said, "All right," she said. "All right." He put his hat back on. He said, "I'll come by Sunday." She said, "I'll have supper." He went out. She stood at the compositor's table for a moment, in the clean March light coming through the window, and then she went back to setting type, because the paper came out on Friday and there was work to do. By the time the cottonwoods came back in May, green and full and loud in the wind off the flats, the Millhaven Courier had the largest subscription list it had ever carried. Prentice had moved to his sister's house on the north side of town, where the cough was managed and the mornings were quiet, and he came to the shop on Tuesdays to read the proofs and drink coffee and say very little, which was a contribution Clara valued. The print shop had a new sign above the door, painted by the bootmaker's son, who had a gift for it. Millhaven Courier, established 1871. C. Sutherland, editor. The C stood for Clara, which the town knew, and the Sutherland was new, which the town also knew, and had marked in the way towns mark things, which is to say it had been noted and stored, and then, gradually, accepted as the way things were, and had perhaps always been heading. The room above the shop was still hers for the press days when she worked late, but most evenings she walked the length of the main street to the livery, where the wide doors stood open in the warm weather, and the smell of hay and horses and worked wood came out into the street, and where Dade was usually at the back table with his accounts or in the yard with a horse, and where there was always a lamp going and something on the stove. The satchel hung on a hook by the door of the livery, repaired and re-repaired, the leather dark with years of handling. She had not replaced it. She did not intend to. On a Friday evening in late May, she was sitting at the table in the livery, with the week's issue spread out in front of her, reading the final copy the way she always did, one last time, looking for the things she might have missed. The piece on the front page was about the water rate credit payments, which had begun going out to the South Road farms that week. The piece was 4 paragraphs. It was accurate. It was plain. It named the families and the amounts and the date, and it quoted Ruth Henderson, who had said simply that it was a long time coming and they were grateful. Dade set a cup of coffee on the table beside her without being asked. He went back to his accounts. The lamp was warm, and the doors were open to the May evening, and somewhere outside a bird was doing the particular thing birds do at the end of a good day, which is to say it was singing without any apparent reason, except that the light was right, and the air was warm, and there was nothing pressing that needed attending to. Clara read the piece one more time. She set it down. She picked up the coffee. The livery held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not any more. Fitch's name did not appear in the paper that week. It had appeared less and less as the months went on, not because Clara avoided it, but because there was less to report. The inquiry had concluded. The rates were adjusted. The charter was the charter. He remained in Millhaven, ran his store, kept his counsel, and did not come to the print shop. This was as close to a resolution as such things ever come, and it was enough. Dorothea Crane had by May moved her concern to other matters, which was the nature of people whose concern is a habit rather than a conviction. She nodded to Clara on the street now, briefly and without warmth, but without hostility either, and Clara nodded back. And this was the arrangement they had arrived at, and it served. The South Road families came to town more often now. Ruth Henderson had taken out a small advertisement in the Courier for the farm's surplus eggs and butter, and she stopped in at the shop on Fridays to pick up her copies, and she and Clara had developed the habit of standing at the counter for 20 minutes or so, talking about the week, which was the beginning of a friendship that would last a long time. The territorial land attorney who had provided the statement had written to say that the Courier's coverage of the water rate case had been cited in 2 subsequent cases in other counties as an example of documented public interest reporting. Clara had read the letter twice and then filed it in the ledger drawer, because it was not the kind of thing you put on the wall, but it was the kind of thing you kept. She was keeping more things now. This was something she had noticed about herself, that she had stopped moving through the world as though she might need to leave it quickly. The photograph was on the wall. The satchel was on the hook. The subscription list was growing. The press was hers. On a Sunday morning in June, she and Dade walked out to the South Road to have supper with the Hendersons, the way they had taken to doing once a month when the weather allowed. The road was dry, and the fields on either side were green, and the light was long and easy. They did not talk much on the walk, which was not a silence that needed filling. It was the silence of 2 people who have been through something together, and have arrived somewhere on the other side of it, and are content to be there. Ruth Henderson met them at the gate and said, "You're just in time. The pie's coming out." And they went in. The little girl, whose name was Bess, was in the yard with a cat and a length of string, and she looked up when Clara came through the gate and said without preamble, "Mama says you write the best newspaper in the territory." "Does she?" Clara said. "She says it every Friday," Bess said, with the same gravity she brought to all important matters. Then she went back to the cat. Clara looked at Dade. The corner of his mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. They went inside, and that was the story of Clara Marsh, a woman who arrived in Millhaven with a worn satchel, and a letter she had mostly written herself, and printed the truth when everyone around her was waiting to see if she would, and who found, in the doing of it, that the truth was not the only thing worth keeping. Let me know in the comments if this one stayed with you. Thank you.